They read the will in a small room that smelled faintly of lemon oil and old books, a gathering that should have been a ritual of remembrance, but turned into the slow, surgical unpeeling of everything I believed to be true. My parents left everything to my brother, down to the house where we had learned to ride bikes and the photos on the mantel that held our childhood like fragile insects pinned in glass, and in that single sentence, my life, already worn thin at the edges from years of caretaking and quiet compromise, snapped into a new, sharper shape marked by neglect, by the sudden and absolute clarity that I had been invisible even to the people who gave me life. For years I had been the shadow in our home, the one who filed the insurance claims when Dad's hands would not stay steady, the one who learned, without choice, how to spoon soup into a mouth that forgot names. The one who sat through long nights listening to my mother's breath, as if it were a metronome counting down to the moment we would be released from worry. And my brother, charismatic and effortless, had always been the one who stepped in only at the highlights, birthdays, graduations, the kind of collage moments suitable for social media, so when the lawyer, with a voice that might have been kinder if it were not so practiced, said to your son, all of their estate, I felt as if I had been pushed off a pier without ever having known I couldn't swim. The first weeks were a blur of phone calls that bent into the same empty pattern. Explanations that were not explanations. Conversations that started sympathetic and ended in excuses. They loved you, people told me, as if love were a ledger to be balanced and location to be allocated. They knew what they were doing, others said, as if knowing equated to justice. But the rooms of my childhood, the linens my mother embroidered, the small china cup with the hairline crack that I used to drink tea from when I was ill, these were not things I could replace with words. The absence of those things became the architecture of my days. Mornings filled with the small, practical indignities of trying to get by without the support others assumed I'd have. Because what did you expect? You were the daughter. You should manage. I was not angry at first. Anger needed a shape and energy I did not possess. So most of my days unfolded in a fog of numbness and questions that had no easy answers. Had I been taken for granted because I stayed? Was loyalty itself a silence that enabled betrayal? When friends asked how I was, I would laugh and say, I'm handling it, because handling sounded better than the truth, that I felt like a ghost in a life I had built and tended. The one everyone now walked through with their heads down as if not to disturb me. Legal counsel was expensive and blunt, and often felt like wading through bureaucratic smoke. The lawyer said my parents had made a legal choice, clear and deliberate, and that challenging a will would require evidence of coercion or lack of capacity. Two words that sounded academic until the nights I replayed my parents' last months. Quote, when the line between preference and coercion seemed as thin as a sheet pulled over a photograph. My brother, when I confronted him, wore surprise like armor. He said he had always been close to Mom and Dad, that they confided in him, that he had been their companion in ways I had not been. In ways I had not been. He did not say, I'm sorry you feel abandoned, because perhaps he could not see how his inheritance felt like a verdict, a declaration that my years of silent stewardship were invisible. Friends and distant relatives took sides politely or awkwardly, and some did not take sides at all, as if neutrality could heal wounds. Strangers on message boards told me to sue, to fight, to be practical, but those instructions were a kind of violence too, one that presumed I had the emotional reserves to wage war against my own family. I found myself shrinking from people who wanted to console me. Consolation felt like a bandage, a temporary measure that smoothed instead of mended. The neglect seeped into other areas. Landlords who once took my rent on time now put passive-aggressive notices under my door. A cousin who asked for help moving the year before now forgot to return calls. Neighbors who had once waved from across the hall crossed the street to avoid me. It was as if the label placed on me by that will, unloved, dispensable, a statistic, had quietly rearranged the world. And yet, in the hollow left by property and public sympathy, there were small, stubborn things that refused to be taken. The rhythm of my own breath, the memory of my mother's laugh when a joke landed just right, the way Dad used to trace the rim of his teacup as if measuring time by habit. These remnants, small and ordinary, became the basis of my resistance. I began to collect evidence not because I believed in courtroom vindication, but because assembling my life into a record of care reminded me I had mattered. I photographed receipts, cataloged dates when I had been the one to sign forms, saved text messages where my parents had written their appreciation in passing. Each image and message felt like a single brick in a wall I was building to shelter myself from the cold of neglect. At night, when old sounds returned, the quiet of the house after everyone else had gone, the memories that felt like live wires, I would go back to the photo albums and trace the faces with finger and memory, and I would remind myself that care is not always rewarded with legal titles or public praise. Sometimes it is its own currency, strange and unconvertible, and yet that did not stop the ache of being disregarded. I told myself stories to stay awake through those months, that someday my brother would come to see what was done and feel shame, that karma had a bank account I could not currently access, that the world in some eventual reckoning would restore balance. But stories are not law, and grief is cleverer than theory. It finds your weak places and nests there, expanding until even tasks like grocery shopping feel freighted with meaning. In the small private negotiations of everyday life, asking for a neighbor's help to move a heavy piece of furniture, pleading with a social worker for assistance with a benefit I had been eligible for, sitting in the doctor's waiting room while someone younger took the last available appointment. I learned the vocabulary of survival, persistence, refusal, the quiet accumulation of no into a shape I could live inside. I also learned the loneliness that comes from being the only person in your house who remembers the small things, the exact cadence of Dad's humming, the peculiar way my mother would fold napkins, the particular foods that would make them smile. These were not valuable in the legal sense, but they were mine, and defending them became a kind of devotion. There were nights when I wanted to scream until my throat gave out, to make a sound big enough to register on the Richter scale of my family's indifference, but the scream would often turn into a single hoarse whisper that read like a confession. I am here. I sought therapy because friends said it would help, and because I needed a place where my anger could be held without being judged or diminished. In the soft-lit room of the counselor's office, I learned to name my feelings, to unspool the knot of resentment and shame into threads I could examine without being smothered by them. Grief, I was told, does not always look like crying. Sometimes it looks like the repetitive, meticulous work of telling your story until it is fully told. So I told it, again and again, to anyone who would listen, to a journal I bought with the small money left to me, to a community center where others with similar scars gathered on Sundays to share food and stories and occasionally laughter. That laughter felt almost illicit at first, like laughing at a funeral, but it became proof that I could still find light in a life that had been dimmed. The legal route remained uncertain. My lawyer suggested mediation as a less brutal alternative to litigation, a way to perhaps recover some personal property without turning my family into opponents in a courtroom drama. Mediators are practitioners of compromise, which is both a blessing and a subtle erasure. To compromise is to admit there is something you may never fully recover. Still, we went into mediation with files and photographs and calendars and the stubborn conviction that narrative matters, that if we could show, beyond emotion and into chronology, how my actions had kept my parents alive and functional, perhaps justice could be bent toward mercy. Mediation was a long, slow tilt of conversations, my brother offering monetary gestures like bandages, me asking for the return of certain items, and for acknowledgement of the ways I'd been erased. I wanted, with a child's bluntness, to hear "I'm sorry" articulate itself in his mouth. Instead, I heard logistics and promises and an unwillingness to name the hurt he'd caused. We settled on a handful of items returned and a letter that would become part of our private archive. My brother's attempt at reconciliation that read like a press release. Cautious, polished, careful not to commit to anything that might inconvenience him. The small victories felt like both relief and sorrow. Relief because the teacup came back into my possession, and sorrow because its return had cost so much of me. In the months that followed, I learned to reconstruct a life with less. I sold things I did not need, renegotiated the terms of my living situation, and found a job that paid for the legal bills and put a slow, steady rhythm back into my days. I found community in places I had not expected. Volunteer groups where older women knitted and compared recipes, a neighbor 2 floors down who had lost her sister and who brought over dumplings, and a silence that felt like understanding. Quote, and a small bookstore where the owner would set aside used paperbacks and let me trade stories for a cup of coffee. These petites revolutions, tiny, ordinary acts of making, became scaffolds. There were nights when the hurt returned with a physicality that made the world tilt. I would fold my parents' shirt and catch the scent of them, or a song would come on the radio that they both loved, and the tears would come like rain you cannot forecast. But life mercifully kept making itself in the interstices, an unexpected friendship, the acceptance of my photograph in a local gallery, a letter from someone who had experienced something similar and wrote to tell me my words had made them feel less alone. Those messages were a kind of balm. They reminded me our stories create secret economies of empathy that aren't counted on ledgers but are counted nonetheless. Over time, my relationship with my brother shifted into something more complex than hatred or forgiveness. It became a negotiation of boundaries. We learned to speak around the things we could not yet say directly. He invited me to his child's birthday party one year, and I went because I wanted to see them laugh. I left early, because presence does not always equal reconciliation. He called on holidays with a tone that suggested relief rather than affection, and I answered him with a civility that surprised us both. Perhaps the greatest lesson was this: that neglect, when unacknowledged, eats at the self like an acid, reshaping the edges until you scarcely recognize your silhouette. But when acknowledged, when given words and contracts and the mundane trappings of evidence, it loses some of its power. That did not restore what had been lost, the evenings we could have shared, the stories left untold, but it allowed me to reclaim a narrative voice I had been afraid to use. I began to write about it, first in private and then for a small online column where others shared their experiences. The act of writing made the pain into material I could shape. It turned the isolation into a bridge. In readers' responses, I found a chorus of survival that was both humbling and fortifying. Messages from people who had been overlooked, ignored, legally disinherited, emotionally abandoned. Each message a testament to the quiet cruelty that can pass for family life and to the fierce, resourceful love people still carry for themselves. Feeling, I learned, is not a destination but a practice, a daily recommitment to small kindnesses toward oneself. To the tedious paperwork of inner work, to the sometimes awkward business of finding new ways to be seen. There were still pangs, holidays that felt like traps, acquaintances who asked pointed questions about inheritance as if money were the only true measure of worth. But they became shorter, less central. I began to volunteer at a helpline for those facing family disputes, offering the kind of listening I had wished for. In that work, I discovered the paradox of empathy. By holding others' pain, I often could loosen my own. Years later, when my brother sent an envelope containing a faded photograph of our parents with a note, I missed them. I did not open it immediately. I wanted to be certain I had the distance to see a gesture for what it was, not what I wanted it to be. When I did open it, the photograph commanded both grief and gratitude. It reminded me of the complicated, imperfect people my parents were, people who made choices that hurt as well as comforted, who loved in ways that were both deep and limited. I wrote him back, not with accusation but with the truthful catalog of what had happened, the hurt and the care alike, and an invitation to a conversation if he was willing to listen without defense. He responded with halting sentences that smelled of regret and a new willingness to meet in the middle ground of shared memories rather than contested possessions. We did not reconcile fully. Reconciliation is a long, arduous work that sometimes cannot be forced. But we began to speak in ways that acknowledged both wounds and responsibilities. In the end, the theft was not only of things but of the simplest human dignity. To be seen by those who know you best, reclaiming that dignity did not happen with court papers or with returned china. It happened in the slow, deliberate rebuilding of a life that included new friendships and old memories, in the writing that transformed personal pain into communal voice, in the decision to protect my future by setting boundaries and making practical plans, and in the curious, stubborn fact that the human heart, though cruelly tested, keeps finding ways to give itself to life. I kept the teacup in a place of honor on a small shelf, not as a monument to loss, but as a reminder of what I had tended. A life of quiet devotion that ultimately taught me how to love myself the way I had once loved others. And while the bruises are still there, faint and sometimes raw, they are mapped now, not as indictments but as geography I know how to navigate. If you ask me whether the neglect changed me, I will tell you this. It broke open parts of me that I will always carry, yes. But it also revealed reserves of resilience I did not know I had. The will had been a legal instrument that redistributed property, but it could not redistribute my memories or the fact of my care. In the slow economy of living, that truth proved to be a kind of inheritance in its own right, a stubborn private wealth that no document could erase.